At 71 years old, Jermaine Jackson has lived long enough to watch nearly every chapter of his extraordinary life become part of music history. He has stood beneath screaming stadium lights, heard thousands of fans chant his family's name, watched records climb the charts, and witnessed a small group of brothers from Gary, Indiana become one of the most famous musical families the world has ever known. But behind that incredible story lies something far more complicated. Because when people hear the name Jackson, one figure usually dominates the conversation. Michael. The king of pop. The global phenomenon. The younger brother whose fame eventually became so enormous that it cast a shadow over almost everyone around him. And for Jermaine, that shadow was never simply professional. It was personal. Long before Michael Jackson became the most recognizable entertainer on earth, Jermaine was already singing beside him. The Jackson brothers grew up in a modest home in Gary, Indiana, under the strict supervision of their father, Joseph Jackson. Music was not treated like a casual childhood hobby. Rehearsals were serious. Expectations were high. Mistakes mattered. For the boys, there was little separation between family life and performance. Jermaine became one of the earliest central voices in the group. He sang lead on several songs and played bass guitar, helping create the foundation that would eventually become the Jackson 5 sound. At first, the dream belonged to all of them. Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, Michael. 5 brothers rehearsing together, traveling together, performing together, and imagining a future in which their family might finally escape the limitations of their surroundings. Then something extraordinary happened. The world noticed them. After signing with Motown, the Jackson 5 exploded into popular culture. Songs such as I Want You Back, ABC, and The Love You Save transformed them into teenage superstars. For Jermaine, success came almost unbelievably fast. One moment, he was a young boy rehearsing with his brothers. The next, he was appearing on television, touring across the country, meeting celebrities, and hearing fans scream his name. Most people would consider that an impossible dream fulfilled. But fame has a strange way of changing the balance inside a family. Michael was younger, smaller, and initially just another member of the group. Yet his voice was impossible to ignore. His charisma was different. His ability to command attention seemed almost instinctive. As the Jackson 5 became more successful, Michael increasingly became the public face of the act. Jermaine was still important. He was still talented. He was still successful. But the center of gravity was beginning to shift. It would be unfair to describe Jermaine as jealous simply because Michael became more famous. Their relationship was far more complex than a simple rivalry. They were brothers who had shared bedrooms, rehearsals, long car rides, stages, exhaustion, success, and pressures that very few children could ever understand. But imagine what that experience must have felt like. You spend your childhood helping build something from nothing. You become internationally famous. You achieve more before adulthood than most musicians achieve in an entire lifetime. And then, gradually, the world begins to remember the story differently. Instead of 5 brothers, people increasingly see one future superstar surrounded by 4 others. That transformation did not happen overnight. But it changed everything. The Jackson family had created something remarkable, yet their success also placed them inside a machine that constantly demanded more. More songs, more performances, more interviews, more tours, more perfection. There was little room to simply be young. Jermaine's adolescence unfolded in public. His career decisions became headlines. His relationships became public interest. His family disagreements became entertainment. And eventually, he would face a decision that separated him from his brothers at one of the most important moments of their careers. In the mid-1970s, the Jackson brothers prepared to leave Motown and continue their careers elsewhere. Jermaine made a different choice. He stayed behind. To outsiders, it may have looked like a business decision. But within the Jackson story, it represented something deeper. Jermaine was married to Hazel Gordy, the daughter of Motown founder Berry Gordy. His personal life, professional ambitions, marriage, and family loyalties had become tangled together. For the first time, the brothers who had seemingly moved as one unit were moving in different directions. And Jermaine was the one left standing on the other side. The group continued without him for a period. His younger brother Randy stepped into the lineup. Jermaine pursued his own solo career. From the outside, he still appeared successful. He recorded albums. He performed. He remained famous. But the emotional reality was far more complicated. Because the Jackson name had become both his greatest advantage and his greatest burden. Every solo achievement was compared to the family. Every decision was interpreted through the family. And as Michael's solo career began accelerating toward unprecedented heights, Jermaine would soon experience one of the cruelest contradictions imaginable. He had helped build the musical foundation that introduced Michael Jackson to the world. But eventually, the world would begin asking Jermaine what it felt like to be Michael Jackson's brother. And that was only the beginning. Because fame, rivalry, family separation, and career pressure would eventually be overshadowed by something far more painful. Years later, Jermaine would watch the little brother who once stood beside him on tiny stages become the biggest star on earth. Then, in 2009, the unimaginable would happen. The music would stop. Michael would be gone. And Jermaine Jackson would suddenly discover that no amount of fame, money, history, or success could prepare a brother for that kind of loss. By the time Jermaine Jackson entered adulthood, the Jackson family was no longer simply a family. It was an institution. Their name carried commercial power. Their appearances generated headlines. Their records sold around the world. And every major decision seemed capable of changing not just one person's future, but the direction of the entire family. For Jermaine, that reality created a conflict that would follow him for years. He wanted independence. But he could never completely separate himself from the Jackson identity. His decision to remain with Motown while his brothers moved on became one of the earliest examples of that tension. To understand why the moment mattered so much, it is necessary to remember what the Jackson brothers had already endured together. They had spent their childhood rehearsing under extraordinary pressure. They had traveled together. They had performed together. They had learned how to smile for cameras even when exhausted. They had experienced success as a unit. So when the brothers eventually made different career choices, the separation carried an emotional weight that ordinary business disagreements rarely have. Jermaine was not merely leaving colleagues. He was temporarily moving away from the people with whom he had built his entire identity. And while he remained connected to Motown, his brothers entered a new era. The Jackson 5 became the Jacksons. New music followed. New opportunities appeared. And Jermaine was suddenly watching part of the family story continue without him. That kind of separation can be difficult under any circumstances. But for Jermaine, it happened in full public view. Every career move could be interpreted as evidence of conflict. Every interview could be analyzed for hidden tension. Every success or failure became part of a larger narrative about the Jackson family. Yet Jermaine refused to disappear. He continued recording as a solo artist and developed a career that included successful singles, albums, and collaborations. His voice had a smoothness that was distinctly different from Michael's. He possessed his own musical identity. And during certain periods, Jermaine demonstrated that he could command attention without standing beside his brothers. But there was one problem no amount of talent could solve. Michael was becoming something the entertainment industry had almost never seen before. As the late 1970s gave way to the 1980s, Michael's solo career accelerated dramatically. Then came Off the Wall. And after that, Thriller. The scale of Michael's success changed the Jackson family forever. He was no longer simply the most famous member of the group. He became one of the most famous human beings on the planet. His music videos became cultural events. His dance moves were copied around the world. His fashion became instantly recognizable. His concerts turned into spectacles. And wherever Michael went, enormous attention followed. For Jermaine, this created an unusual reality. He was famous, but his younger brother was historically famous. There is a profound difference between those two things. Jermaine could walk into a room and be recognized. Michael could change the atmosphere of an entire city simply by arriving. And once that level of fame entered the family, every sibling was forced to live beside it. The comparison became unavoidable. Journalists wanted to discuss Michael. Fans wanted stories about Michael. Even when Jermaine promoted his own work, the conversation could return to Michael. This was not necessarily anyone's intention. It was simply the gravitational force of enormous celebrity. But over time, living beside that kind of force could become exhausting. Jermaine had achievements of his own. He had performed before huge audiences. He had sold records. He had experienced the type of career that countless musicians would consider extraordinary. Yet within the Jackson universe, extraordinary could somehow feel ordinary. That contradiction became one of the defining tensions of his life. And it was not limited to music. The Jackson family's personal lives increasingly became public property. Romantic relationships were scrutinized. Marriages were discussed in tabloids. Disagreements became entertainment. Rumors could travel around the world before anyone inside the family had a chance to respond. Jermaine's private life was no exception. His relationships, marriages, and children became part of the public fascination surrounding the Jackson dynasty. For a man raised in a tightly controlled family environment, the loss of privacy must have been striking. There was no ordinary adulthood waiting for him. There was no way to quietly make mistakes. The Jackson name guaranteed attention. Sometimes that attention brought opportunity. Other times, it amplified pain. Eventually, Jermaine reunited professionally with his brothers. The return carried symbolic weight. The family that had once divided over career decisions could stand together again. But by then, too much had changed for the old dynamic to return completely. Michael's star had grown beyond the boundaries of the group. The brothers were no longer children chasing the same dream. They were adult men with separate careers, families, ambitions, disappointments, and complicated histories. The innocence of Gary, Indiana, was gone. In its place stood a famous family trying to maintain relationships under circumstances few people could understand. And then came another difficult truth. Success does not freeze time. The brothers grew older. Their parents aged. Their children became adults. The industry changed. The audiences changed. And slowly, the Jackson family began entering a stage of life where celebration was increasingly accompanied by loss. For Jermaine, the greatest loss was still ahead. He had known Michael not as an icon, but as a child. Before the sequin gloves. Before the moonwalk. Before the stadiums. Before the scandals. Before the endless headlines. Jermaine remembered the little boy rehearsing with his brothers. He remembered Michael before the world claimed him. And that made what happened in June 2009 almost impossible to process. When news spread that Michael Jackson had died at only 50 years old, millions of fans experienced shock. Television networks interrupted programming. Crowds gathered. People cried in streets around the world. But while the public mourned an entertainer, Jermaine was confronting something completely different. He was losing his brother. And in one of the most painful moments imaginable, Jermaine became one of the family members who had to face cameras and confirm what the world desperately hoped was not true. The boy who had once stood beside him on stage was gone. The superstar whose fame had overshadowed the entire family was gone. The person who had connected Jermaine's childhood to the rest of the world was gone. And after decades of being asked what it was like to live in Michael Jackson's shadow, Jermaine suddenly had to learn what it meant to live in a world without Michael at all. That chapter would change him forever. June 25, 2009 changed the Jackson family forever. For the rest of the world, Michael Jackson's death was a global event. Newsrooms went into emergency coverage. Fans gathered outside hospitals, homes, and concert venues. Radio stations abandoned normal programming and played his songs for hours. Tributes appeared almost instantly across continents. But inside the Jackson family, there was no distance between the headline and the pain. This was not the death of a superstar. This was the death of a brother. Jermaine had known Michael before the fame became unimaginable. He had known him before the stadiums, before the private estates, before the photographers followed his every movement. He remembered the boy who rehearsed in Gary. He remembered the brother who stood beside him on tiny stages. He remembered the long drives, the family rehearsals, the arguments, the laughter, and the exhaustion that had shaped their childhood. And suddenly, all of that belonged to the past. The public watched Jermaine closely in the days after Michael's death. He appeared before cameras at UCLA Medical Center and confirmed that Michael had died. It was one of the most painful public duties a brother could possibly face. Imagine receiving devastating news and almost immediately knowing that millions of people are waiting for you to speak. There was no private room in which the Jackson family could simply grieve. The world wanted answers. What happened? Where was Michael? What would happen to his children? What would happen to his music? What would happen to the Jackson family? For Jermaine, grief became inseparable from responsibility. He was not only mourning, he was representing the family. That distinction mattered. When a famous person dies, the public often feels a genuine sense of loss. Fans associate music with childhood memories, relationships, celebrations, and difficult moments in their own lives. But the family experiences something entirely different. They lose the person behind the image. And Jermaine seemed determined to remind the world of that difference. Michael Jackson had become a symbol so large that many people forgot he had once been simply Michael. A son. A father. A brother. Jermaine later spoke and wrote about him from that perspective. He wanted people to understand the human being hidden beneath decades of headlines. That desire became especially important because Michael's life had been surrounded by controversy. By the time he died, public perception of him had become deeply divided. To some, he remained an unmatched musical genius. To others, allegations and scandals had permanently changed the way they saw him. For the Jackson family, however, the conversation was never abstract. Whatever the world believed about Michael, they had shared a lifetime with him. Jermaine became one of his most visible defenders. At times, his loyalty was intense. He challenged narratives he believed were unfair. He defended Michael's legacy. He criticized people he believed had misunderstood or exploited his brother. And eventually, he wrote about Michael from the perspective of someone who had been there before the mythology began. That role carried its own burden. Because defending someone after death means fighting a battle that can never truly end. The person you are defending cannot answer questions. They cannot correct misconceptions. They cannot explain themselves. Every new documentary, interview, accusation, tribute, or anniversary can reopen the same wounds. For Jermaine, Michael's death did not bring closure. In many ways, it guaranteed that the conversation would continue forever. And there was another painful layer. For decades, Jermaine had lived with comparisons to Michael. Now those comparisons could never evolve. Michael would remain frozen in public memory at 50 years old. Jermaine would continue aging. Every birthday would move him further away from the young man who once performed beside Michael. Every anniversary would remind him how much time had passed. Every family gathering would contain an absence that could not be filled. This is one of the cruelest things about grief. Life keeps moving even when part of you remains attached to a specific moment. For the Jackson family, there were still children to raise. Careers continued. Tours continued. Birthdays happened. New generations entered the entertainment industry. But Michael's absence remained. Jermaine's relationship with his brother had not always been simple. No sibling relationship spanning decades ever is. The Jacksons had experienced rivalry, disagreement, professional competition, and periods of separation. There had been moments when the brothers moved in different directions. There had also been public speculation about tension between them. But death has a way of making old disagreements feel painfully small. Suddenly, there is no future conversation in which everything can be explained. No next phone call. No reunion where difficult memories can be rewritten. Only what was said. What was left unsaid. And what can never be changed. Jermaine was forced to carry all of that forward. Yet Michael's death was not the end of loss for the Jackson family. The brothers who had once seemed frozen forever in those youthful photographs were growing older. The image of 5 boys in matching outfits could create the illusion that the Jackson 5 would always exist somewhere exactly as the public remembered them. But time does not respect photographs. One by one, the realities of aging began replacing the mythology of eternal youth. For Jermaine, that truth became devastatingly clear again in September 2024. His brother Tito Jackson died at 70. Tito had been there from the beginning, before Motown, before television, before international fame, before Michael became a global icon. Tito was part of the original foundation. He played guitar while Jermaine played bass. Together, they had built the rhythm behind the songs that changed their family's destiny. Now another brother was gone. Michael's death had already created an enormous emptiness. Tito's passing made the family circle smaller again. And for Jermaine, now approaching the age Tito had been when he died, the meaning of time must have become impossible to ignore. The Jackson brothers had spent much of their lives looking forward. Toward the next performance. The next album. The next opportunity. But by Jermaine's 70s, looking backward had become unavoidable. He could see decades of triumph. He could see mistakes. He could see marriages, children, reunions, and disagreements. And he could see empty spaces where brothers once stood. The public still saw the Jackson name and thought of music history. Jermaine increasingly had something else to remember. Faces. Voices. Childhood rooms. Brothers who were no longer there. And while the world continued celebrating the legend of the Jackson family, Jermaine was learning one of life's hardest lessons. Sometimes surviving long enough to remember everything can become its own kind of heartbreak. By the time Jermaine Jackson reached his 70s, loss was no longer something that belonged only to the distant past. It had become part of the present. Michael was gone. Tito was gone. The family that once seemed unstoppable had been permanently changed by time, age, and death. But grief was not the only pressure following Jermaine into this chapter of his life. There was also the weight of the Jackson name itself. For most people, a surname is simply an identity. For Jermaine, Jackson became a permanent public label. It opened doors. It created opportunities. It guaranteed attention. But it also meant that almost nothing he did could ever remain completely separate from the larger family story. That was especially true in his personal life. Over the decades, Jermaine experienced marriages, relationships, children, separations, and public scrutiny that often unfolded under the gaze of entertainment media. His first marriage, to Hazel Gordy, tied him directly to another powerful music dynasty. Hazel was the daughter of Motown founder Berry Gordy, the man whose company had helped turn the Jackson 5 into international stars. At first glance, the union appeared almost symbolic. A Jackson marrying a Gordy. Two families connected at the center of American popular music. But celebrity marriages are rarely as simple as they appear from the outside. Behind the photographs and famous names were two people attempting to build a private relationship while surrounded by an industry that treated their lives as public material. The marriage eventually ended. And Jermaine's romantic life remained a source of fascination for tabloids for years afterward. He later had other relationships and marriages, and the structure of his extended family became increasingly complicated. That complexity often attracted sensational coverage. But beneath the celebrity framing was something more ordinary and human. Jermaine was trying to navigate adulthood, while carrying the expectations attached to one of the most recognized surnames in entertainment. Every private decision risked becoming public conversation. Every breakup could become a headline. Every family disagreement could be transformed into a story. That kind of exposure can distort relationships. It can also make reconciliation more difficult. Most families have conflicts that disappear behind closed doors. The Jackson family rarely had that luxury. Their disagreements could be reported before they were resolved. A single comment from one sibling could be interpreted as evidence of a feud. Silence could be interpreted as hostility. A public appearance could be analyzed for body language. And sometimes, rumors became more memorable than the facts. Jermaine lived inside that environment for decades. Perhaps that is one reason his public image became difficult to define. Was he the loyal older brother? The solo artist? The former Jackson 5 star? The defender of Michael? The controversial family member? The answer depended on which headline someone had read most recently. But Jermaine was more complicated than any single description. He had experienced enormous privilege and enormous pressure at the same time. That combination can be difficult for outsiders to understand. Fame provided him with things most people could only imagine. Travel. Money. Access. Recognition. The ability to perform before enormous audiences. But fame also removed certain freedoms that ordinary people take for granted. The freedom to fail quietly. The freedom to change your mind without explanation. The freedom to have a family argument without strangers choosing sides. The freedom to age without the public constantly comparing your present face to photographs taken 50 years earlier. And aging may be one of the most underestimated parts of Jermaine's story. Popular culture tends to freeze celebrities at the moment of their greatest success. For Jermaine, that image is often the young man standing alongside his brothers in the Jackson 5. Stylish clothes. Perfect hair. Bright stage lights. Fans screaming. Everything ahead of them. But the man living in the present is separated from that image by more than half a century. He has watched music change completely. He has watched the business that created the Jackson 5 transform into a digital industry. He has watched younger generations discover the group through videos recorded before they were born. And he has watched his own children grow old enough to build identities of their own. That became especially significant as another generation of Jacksons entered entertainment. One of Jermaine's sons, Jaffer Jackson, was chosen to portray Michael Jackson in the major biographical film Michael. The casting created an extraordinary circle. Jermaine had spent his childhood performing beside Michael. Decades later, Jermaine's own son would be asked to recreate Michael's life for the screen. For almost any father, watching a child receive a major role would be emotional. For Jermaine, The situation carried layers that few people could fully understand. Jaffer was not simply portraying a famous musician. He was portraying his uncle, Jermaine's little brother, a man whose life had transformed the Jackson family and whose death had left a permanent wound. Imagine watching your own son learn Michael's movements. Study his expressions. Recreate performances that you witnessed firsthand. Wear clothing inspired by a brother you can no longer speak to. For Jermaine, the experience could not have been purely professional. It was history returning through another generation. And perhaps that is why the Jackson legacy is both a gift and a burden. It refuses to disappear. The music keeps playing. The videos remain. The photographs remain. New audiences continue discovering Michael. New audiences continue discovering the Jackson 5. And Jermaine continues living inside a story that began when he was a child. But there is something almost cruel about preservation. Recorded music allows a voice to remain young forever. Film allows a face to remain unchanged forever. Michael can still appear on a screen at 25. Tito can still be seen smiling beside his brothers. The Jackson 5 can still perform ABC as if no time has passed. Jermaine, however, lives in real time. He grows older. He remembers what happened after the camera stopped recording. He knows which relationships became complicated. He knows which people disappeared from the family photographs. And he knows the difference between the mythology audiences celebrate and the reality the family endured. At 71, that gap may be wider than ever. But just when it seemed that Jermaine's later years would be defined mainly by memory, family legacy, and the loss of his brothers, another chapter emerged. This one was not nostalgic. It was deeply serious. A decades-old allegation returned to public attention. A civil lawsuit followed. Then came a multi-million-dollar default judgment and Jermaine's attempt to challenge it. Suddenly, the conversation surrounding him was no longer only about Michael, the Jackson 5, or the painful history of his family. It was about Jermaine himself. And at 71, he was facing one of the most consequential controversies of his entire public life. For decades, Jermaine Jackson had been discussed primarily through the lens of his family. Michael's success. The Jackson 5 legacy. Motown. The complicated relationships between brothers. The marriages. The reunions. The losses. But in the later years of Jermaine's life, the public conversation changed sharply. This time, the story was not about standing in Michael Jackson's shadow. It was about an allegation directed at Jermaine himself. And because the accusation was extremely serious, it is important to separate confirmed legal developments from claims that remain disputed. A woman named Rita Butler Barrett accused Jermaine Jackson of sexually assaulting her in 1988. The allegation surfaced publicly through a civil lawsuit filed decades after the alleged incident. Jermaine denied the accusation. That distinction matters. An allegation is not automatically proof. And a civil legal judgment is not the same thing as a criminal conviction. But the case nevertheless became one of the most serious controversies attached to Jermaine's name. In May 2026, a Los Angeles court entered a multi-million-dollar default judgment against him after he failed to respond properly to the lawsuit. The figure exceeded $6 million. To anyone reading the headline quickly, that could sound like a conventional trial had taken place, and a jury had listened to both sides before deciding the facts. That was not what happened. A default judgment generally occurs when a defendant does not participate in the legal process as required. It can still carry major legal consequences. But it is procedurally different from a fully contested trial in which evidence is tested through testimony, cross-examination, and argument from both sides. Jermaine later moved to challenge the judgment. His position was that there had been problems with the way he was identified and served in the case. He also denied the underlying sexual assault allegation. For Jermaine, the stakes were enormous. This was not simply another entertainment industry rumor. It was a legal dispute involving a serious accusation, substantial financial exposure, and reputational damage. And at 71 years old, he suddenly found himself confronting a controversy rooted in an alleged event from nearly 4 decades earlier. That is a remarkable span of time. Think about everything that had happened between 1988 and 2026. Michael became an even larger global figure. The Jackson family went through marriages, divorces, births, controversies, reunions, and deaths. Music moved from vinyl and cassettes to CDs, downloads, streaming, and social media. Michael died. Tito died. Jermaine became a grandfather, an elder member of a famous musical dynasty. And then, after all those years, a legal claim from the distant past entered the center of his present life. That collision between past and present is one of the most unsettling themes in Jermaine's later story. Fame creates an archive. Old interviews remain available. Old photographs resurface. Old conflicts can be rediscovered. And allegations connected to events decades earlier can suddenly become current news. For a public figure, there is rarely a clean separation between who they were and who they are now. The past can return at any moment. Jermaine's situation also demonstrates why sensational celebrity storytelling can become dangerous when legal allegations are involved. It is tempting to build suspense by declaring that someone has been exposed or that a shocking secret has finally been proven. But those phrases can misrepresent reality. The responsible way to tell this chapter is more complicated. There was an allegation. There was a civil lawsuit. There was a default judgment. Jermaine denied the accusation, and he sought to have that judgment thrown out. Those facts alone are dramatic enough. There is no need to invent certainty where certainty does not exist. For Jermaine, however, the emotional and reputational consequences were real regardless of how the legal battle ultimately unfolded. His name had already appeared in headlines connected to the accusation. And once an allegation enters the public imagination, it can be nearly impossible to erase. This is especially true for someone carrying a surname as famous as Jackson. Any story involving Jermaine automatically becomes connected to decades of public fascination with the entire family. Michael's controversies. The family's internal disputes. The mythology surrounding their childhood. The enormous cultural legacy. Everything becomes part of the same conversation. And Jermaine had already spent most of his life trying to exist as an individual inside that enormous narrative. Now he faced perhaps the strongest reminder yet that the public would never view him as simply a private man. Even at 71, his life remained material for global headlines. Still, this chapter should not erase everything that came before it. A person's biography is rarely simple enough to fit into one scandal. Jermaine Jackson helped shape one of the most influential groups in popular music. He built a solo career. He became a father. He experienced marriages and divorces. He lost brothers. He defended Michael's memory. He watched another generation of Jacksons step into the spotlight. And he accumulated decades of relationships, mistakes, achievements, grief, and controversy. The legal case became another major chapter. But it was not the only chapter. That complexity is what makes Jermaine's story so difficult to reduce to a single headline. The young bass player from Gary, Indiana, could never have imagined the life ahead of him. He could not have known that his little brother would become the most famous entertainer of their generation. He could not have known that he would spend decades answering questions about Michael. He could not have known that 2 of the brothers who once stood beside him would die before him. And he almost certainly could not have imagined that in his 70s, his own name would be at the center of such a serious legal controversy. Yet through every chapter, one pattern remained. Jermaine survived. He survived the pressure of childhood fame. He survived family separation. He survived professional comparison. He survived the death of Michael. He survived the death of Tito. And now he was confronting another crisis in a life already filled with extraordinary extremes. But surviving does not mean escaping unchanged. Every loss leaves something behind. Every controversy changes how the world sees you. Every passing year removes another piece of the life you once knew. And for Jermaine Jackson, perhaps the hardest truth of all was becoming impossible to ignore. The Jackson story was no longer about 5 young brothers racing toward the future. It had become a story about memory, legacy, absence, and the few people left alive who still remembered what everything looked like before the world knew their names. Jermaine was one of those people. And at 71, he was carrying more of that history than ever before. For Jermaine Jackson, growing older has meant something more complicated than simply watching the years pass. It has meant becoming one of the remaining witnesses to a story that once seemed larger than life. There was a time when the Jackson brothers were everywhere. They appeared on television. Their records dominated radio. Fans screamed outside hotels. Their photographs covered magazines. To millions of people, they seemed untouchable. But inside the family, time was always moving. Children became adults. Marriages changed. Careers rose and fell. Relationships became more complicated. And eventually, the brothers who once stood shoulder to shoulder began confronting the one thing fame could never defeat: mortality. For Jermaine, that realization must have become especially powerful after the deaths of Michael and Tito. Those losses did more than remove 2 brothers from the family. They changed the meaning of the past. Old photographs suddenly carried more weight. Old performances became more emotional. Songs that once represented success could now represent people who were no longer alive. That is one of the strange realities of surviving. Memories become more valuable at the same time that they become more painful. Jermaine can still look back at the Jackson 5 and see 5 brothers at the beginning of everything. The audience sees history. He sees family. The audience sees choreography. He may remember exhaustion. The audience hears perfect harmonies. He may remember arguments, rehearsals, jokes, rivalries, and conversations that were never recorded. That difference matters, because celebrity history often simplifies people. It turns complicated lives into recognizable images. Michael becomes the king of pop. Tito becomes the guitarist. Jermaine becomes the brother who stayed with Motown. But real families are never that simple. They are built from thousands of ordinary moments that the public never sees. Meals, phone calls, disagreements, apologies, long silences, private laughter, and eventually goodbyes. By 71, Jermaine had accumulated more of those memories than almost anyone outside the family could understand. But he also carried another burden. The Jackson legacy was still evolving. Michael's music continued reaching new generations. The Jackson 5 remained a foundational part of pop history. Documentaries, books, interviews, archival footage, and biographical projects kept returning to the family story. For many entertainers, fame eventually fades. For the Jacksons, it has been repeatedly renewed. That means Jermaine has never truly been allowed to leave his past behind. Every anniversary can bring old questions back. Every new Michael-related project can reopen public debate. Every rediscovered interview can create a new headline. And every generation wants to understand how one family produced such extraordinary success. For Jermaine, there is probably no simple answer. The Jackson story contained talent, discipline, ambition, sacrifice, control, competition, love. pressure, and circumstances so unusual that ordinary family rules often did not apply. Perhaps that is why the surviving brothers have always seemed to carry two versions of their childhood. One version is the dream. The other is the cost. The dream was obvious. They escaped Gary, Indiana. They became stars. They traveled the world. They changed popular music. They created opportunities for generations of artists who followed. But the cost was more difficult to measure. How much normal childhood disappeared inside rehearsals? How much privacy vanished once fame arrived? How much pressure existed inside a family where extraordinary performance became expected? How difficult was it to build an individual identity when the family name was already bigger than any one person? Jermaine spent most of his life answering those questions indirectly. Sometimes through music. Sometimes through interviews. Sometimes through public disagreements. Sometimes through the way he defended Michael. And sometimes through silence. One of the most revealing aspects of Jermaine's later life has been his continued connection to the family legacy. He did not simply walk away and pretend the past never happened. He participated in reunions. He spoke about Michael. He reflected on their history. And he supported the next generation of Jackson performers. That next generation may now represent one of the most emotional parts of his story. His son Jaffer Jackson stepping into the role of Michael for a major biographical film creates a connection that almost feels impossible. A son portraying his father's brother. A nephew recreating the life of an uncle who became a global icon. And Jermaine watching from the other side of decades of memory. There is something deeply symbolic about that. When Jermaine was young, he helped stand beside Michael while Michael became famous. Now in old age, he can watch his own son help retell Michael's story. The circle is almost complete. But circles do not erase loss. They only give it another form. Jaffer can recreate a performance. He can study Michael's movements. He can wear costumes inspired by him. He can reproduce moments from the past. But he cannot bring Michael back. No movie can do that. No song can do that. No amount of archival footage can restore a brother. And perhaps this is where Jermaine's story becomes less about celebrity and more about something universal. Eventually, every family becomes a collection of memories. Parents age. Siblings disappear. Children grow up. The places that once defined childhood change or vanish. People spend the first half of life building a future and the second half discovering how much of that future has already become the past. Jermaine simply experienced that process on a scale visible to millions. The world has photographs of his childhood. The world has recordings of his adolescence. The world can replay his brother's voices whenever it wants. That may sound like a gift, but it can also be cruel. Most people lose someone and gradually become accustomed to their absence. Jermaine lives in a world where Michael can suddenly appear on a television screen, where an old Jackson 5 song can begin playing in a restaurant, where a stranger can approach him with a photograph taken more than 50 years ago, where the past can return without warning. And each time, the public may experience nostalgia. Jermaine may experience something far more complicated. Love. Pride. Regret. Grief. And the realization that the young men in those photographs had no idea how their story would end. Still, Jermaine remains here. At 71, he has become one of the custodians of the Jackson family memory. Not because the history is perfect. It is not. Not because every controversy has been resolved. It has not. But because he was there. He remembers the beginning. He remembers Michael before the world changed him. He remembers Tito before the stages became enormous. He remembers when the Jackson name belonged primarily to one family inside one small home. And perhaps that is the deepest tragedy of Jermaine Jackson's life. He achieved the impossible. He became famous. He became wealthy. He became part of music history. But none of those things could protect him from the ordinary pain that eventually reaches every human being. The people you love grow older. Some leave before you. And one day, the memories become more crowded than the room itself. At 71, Jermaine Jackson stands in a position few people could ever fully understand. He is not simply an aging singer looking back on a successful career. He is one of the surviving members of a family that helped redefine modern popular music. He remembers the beginning because he lived it. He remembers what happened before the awards, before the television specials, before the private jets, before the enormous crowds, and before Michael Jackson became a name known in almost every corner of the world. And perhaps that is why Jermaine's story becomes more emotional the longer it continues. Because survival changes the meaning of everything. When Jermaine was young, the future must have seemed endless. There would always be another rehearsal, another performance, another record, another family gathering, another chance to talk to a brother after an argument, another opportunity to repair whatever had gone wrong. Youth creates the illusion that time is unlimited. Age destroys that illusion. Michael is no longer there. Tito is no longer there. And the boys who once stood together as the Jackson 5 can never stand together in exactly the same way again. The photographs remain. The music remains. The memories remain. But the moment itself is gone. For the public, those images are nostalgic. They represent an era, a sound, a cultural revolution. For Jermaine, they represent something much more intimate. He can look at an old picture and remember what happened immediately before the camera flashed. He may remember which brother was tired, which one was joking, which argument had just ended, which song they were about to perform, which parent was waiting nearby. That kind of memory is priceless. It can also be painful, because photographs preserve people exactly as they were. Life does not. Jermaine has watched the Jackson family transform from a group of ambitious children into one of the most analyzed families in entertainment history. He has seen their triumphs celebrated. He has seen their mistakes dissected. He has seen private conflicts become public spectacle. He has seen his brother Michael transform from a gifted child into a global phenomenon, then into one of the most controversial and discussed figures in modern entertainment. Through all of it, Jermaine remained connected to the story. Sometimes he stood at the center. Sometimes he stood at the edge. But he never truly escaped it. And perhaps he never wanted to. Family, after all, was where the entire journey began. It was family that created the music. Family that endured the rehearsals. Family that experienced the first taste of success. Family that also carried the consequences. This is why Jermaine's life should not be reduced to the idea that he simply lived in Michael's shadow. That would be too easy. Jermaine had his own talent, his own career, his own relationships, his own mistakes, his own achievements, his own controversies, and his own grief. But being Michael Jackson's brother meant that his identity was always connected to something larger than himself. Even his greatest individual accomplishments existed inside the gravitational field of the Jackson name. That may be one of the strangest forms of fame imaginable. To be known everywhere, yet constantly introduced through someone else. To succeed, yet still be compared. To age, while the most famous person in your family remains forever young in recordings and photographs. And now there is another layer. Jermaine's son Jaffer has stepped into the role of Michael for a new generation. That means Jermaine has lived long enough to watch his family history become cinema. His childhood is no longer only memory. It is being reconstructed, costumes recreated, performances restaged, conversations dramatized. Moments that once belonged privately to a family are being transformed into scenes for millions of strangers. That must be surreal. It may also be deeply emotional, because no actor, even one from the family, can reproduce what it actually felt like to be there. No movie can recreate the uncertainty of those early years. No screenplay can capture every private conversation. No camera can fully explain what it meant to watch Michael grow from a little brother into a phenomenon. Jermaine alone carries his version of those memories. And one day, even those memories will exist only through the stories he chose to tell. That is why age gives his life a different urgency. At 71, legacy is no longer an abstract idea. It is happening around him. His children carry the Jackson name. His grandchildren inherit stories they never witnessed. Fans who were not alive when the Jackson 5 first performed now discover their songs online. History continues moving forward, even as the people who created that history gradually disappear. And Jermaine is now part of the bridge between those worlds. But his later years have not been defined only by remembrance. The serious civil allegations and legal disputes surrounding him in 2026 also demonstrate that public legacy can remain unsettled until very late in life. Jermaine has denied the sexual assault allegation against him and challenged the default judgment entered in the civil case. Whatever future legal developments may bring, the controversy has already become part of how his later life is discussed. That creates an uncomfortable reality. Legacy is rarely something a person controls completely. Fans decide what they remember. Journalists choose which chapters they revisit. Families disagree about the past. Courts may examine claims connected to events from decades earlier. And history can become more complicated, not less, as time passes. Jermaine's biography therefore resists a simple ending. There is no neat conclusion in which every conflict is resolved. There is no final moment where all questions disappear. There is instead an aging man carrying an extraordinary amount of history. Some of it beautiful, some of it painful, some of it controversial, and much of it impossible to separate from the people he loved. Maybe that is what makes the story heartbreaking. Not that Jermaine Jackson lost everything. He did not. He still has family. He still has a musical legacy. He still has decades of achievements that cannot be erased. The tragedy is more subtle. It is the realization that even extraordinary success cannot stop ordinary human loss. You can sell millions of records and still miss your brother. You can hear crowds scream your name and still feel the silence left by someone who is gone. You can become part of history and still wish, perhaps, for one ordinary day from childhood. One rehearsal. One conversation. One room filled with all the brothers again. Before the fame. Before the divisions. Before the scandals. Before the funerals. Before anyone knew how the story would end. The world will continue listening to the Jackson 5. Michael's voice will continue playing. Tito's guitar will remain on the recordings. Jermaine's bass and vocals will still be there beside them. In music, the brothers remain together. And perhaps that is the bittersweet final truth of Jermaine Jackson's story. Time separated them. Death separated them. Life took them in different directions. But press play on the right song, and for 3 minutes, they are young again. 5 brothers. One stage. And an entire future still waiting ahead.